Gamers, welcome back. I'm Robo, a Pokemon TCG Pocket content creator, currently posting shorts, YouTube videos, live streams on the game. And you guys see the title of today's video. We have a lot to unpack, so everybody grab yourselves a cup of coffee and let's get into it. Today we're going to be doing a tier list video to show the best decks as of the end of January 2025 with Genetic Apex and Mythical Island. And as you guys can see in the bottom right hand corner of your screen, I'm going to be showing these decks as well as we go through it. So this video could serve as a good way to screenshot decks that you'd like to try and just get an idea of where the meta is at right now before this next big update we're fixing to have. We've got about 20 decks to cover in this video, and we're kicking it off really strong with Gyarados, Druddigon, and Greninja. I think I got to throw this right in the S tier. I feel like this is one of those decks that we saw benefit the most from the Mythical Island expansion with Druddigon and Leaf and all that, because Gyarados does take a while to get set up, and so having Druddigon in the active slot to serve as that physical, that defensive wall, and give you time, and then also Greninja in the back to get that chip damage, and to have some sort of an offensive pressure with Druddigon in the active slot not actually doing any attacking. It's just a well-rounded deck. Obviously, you need the Leaf to be able to get the Druddigon out, and then any deck with Misty in it is going to have some potential to sweep, right? Misty is just super overpowered. I would say Water right now is in a really great spot in the meta, so we're seeing this deck everywhere. We're seeing it in tournaments. It's plaguing the online matches that I've done. S tier feels really good for it, and I think that's a really strong pick. Also, guys, I am going to be coming at you with some facts in this video, but these tier lists are subjective, so please, in the comments, let me know where you would have ranked some of these decks, and just share your opinions. I'd love to read them. Man, next up we got Mewtwo EX. Where do we put this? This is such a strong deck right now. I feel like it's really silly to not put this deck also in the S tier. It's just such a strong deck. We still see a really high tournament presence with this deck as well. It's been a really strong deck since the beginning of the game. With the Mythical Island expansion, we also got things like Mew, we got Mythical Slab, we got Leaf, and we got these other resources that I think do benefit the deck and actually made it better. It was already extremely strong just with the Genetic Apex. But man, yeah, I think especially with Mythical Island expansion, this deck is holding very strong in the S tier. If you haven't tried it, I highly encourage you to build this deck. There's no better feeling than when you have Mewtwo in the active slot and you get your Gardevoirs in the back to feed your energy to Mewtwo. It's insane, man. You feel unstoppable, and going against it is infuriating as well. It's just, man, what a deck. Next up, we have a deck that has such a special place in my heart, Celebi and Serperior. Man, shout out to you guys, by the way. We had a live stream the other day, and 50,000 people showed up to it on YouTube as we went for the max damage challenge using Celab EX. Absolutely insane. I had such a blast doing that challenge, and we're going to be posting a YouTube video about it as well. So, but if you haven't checked out that live stream, man, it was crazy. This is one of those decks, man. I think Celab EX has the most haters in the meta right now. People are so over this deck, dude. It's actually so funny. Man, this little onion, dude, I love this deck. It's so funny. It's really strong. Do we put this S tier? I don't think I can put this deck S tier. I think that there are some issues with it. It doesn't really have the best matchup against things like Gyarados. The Blaine deck just shreds it. Decks that can get up really quickly and pressure really early, you know, this deck has a hard time with those decks. Obviously, at the end of the day, you still have the luck factor, right, with Celebi. You're flipping coins to do any damage. If your Serperiors are on the bottom of your deck, you're just cooked. I feel like there's some variations of this deck that have made it a lot better, right? Like Executor EX, I think is probably the best variation of this deck for wins. I've also seen some good variations with Lilligant. That's what I used for the max damage challenge. But man, overall, I'd probably put this A tier. I think you could argue for like a B tier, but I think A tier, it's still a very strong deck. My win percentage is still very high whenever I use it in the current meta. I do think we've seen a little bit of a decrease in it being used for tournaments and things like that, but overall in the current state of affairs, I mean, I feel like A tier is fair. I would say Grass as a typing is still really strong in the meta anyway because you have cards like Erica, so you have a lot of healing pressure. It's just very difficult to put these decks away. Then you add in cards like Serperior with the Jungle Totem ability, and now instead of, you know, 4 energy to do attacks, now you just need 2. It just makes the decks so much better. Okay, next up we have this Mythical Island Golem deck, which I've seen rotate a few different mons. I've seen it use Marshadow, Hitmonlee, Druddigon, things like that. I would say this is still a really good deck, man. Where do we put this? I remember when this was first introduced into the meta, it won like a crazy tournament. It had this insane win-loss ratio, and man, whenever I use this on stream, fun fact, this deck still has my highest win percentage out of any deck I've ever used on stream. It just felt like I couldn't lose with it. And with the Mythical Island expansion, we saw this deck get so good. We got that new Graveler, right, which I believe just needs 2 energy instead of 3 to get that attack off. Obviously, things like Leaf really help with the pressure of this deck. You have Druddigon now to leave in the active slot to help your Golem build up. And then we got that new variation of Golem, which whenever you do your attack, you reduce the damage that you receive on the next turn by 30. Whereas with Genetic Apex, the Golem that's in that deck, you do get a little bit more damage with your attack, but you hurt yourself. I believe it's like 50 HP. So I believe this Golem actually is a little bit better. I feel like where we've landed in the current meta, it's reasonable to put this at B tier. I feel like people have figured this out a little bit more. It's not as strong as it was at the start of the meta, but it's still a really good deck. I still feel like it's one you guys need to try. B tier just seems fair to me. Okay, next up we have this Starmie Articuno Misty deck. Where do I put this? I can't even lie to you guys. When I see my opponent using this deck, it strikes fear into my heart still. Just the other day, I had one of those moments where my opponent, turn 1, gets an Articuno Misty, they roll 3 heads, and they just win on turn 1 before I can do anything. This deck is insane. It has the craziest sweep potential. I don't know if I can put it S tier, though. I don't know if I can put it S tier. It does have some bad matchups. You know, the Pikachu EX deck, I always feel like I have a good matchup whenever I play against it using that deck. Man, I feel like A tier is a really good spot for it. You know, I don't think I could put it S tier. It's not B tier or lower. Misty again with the water, man. I mean, I just feel like water's in such a good spot in the meta. You have so much potential. You have that luck factor, obviously, with Misty, but when it goes your way, it can be unstoppable. I feel like A tier is really fair. I highly recommend you guys try this deck. Okay, next up we have the Blaine deck. This deck still holds such a special place in my heart, and I think it is still slept on. I gotta tell you guys, I used the Blaine deck a ton on stream, and I always had a lot of success with it. You get up to speed really quickly with it. Rapidash and Ninetales, they don't require a lot of energy. It's really easy to swap in and out. They both have that single energy retreat cost. Blaine just makes these cards hit so hard. Against Celab, you know, it just shreds through Celab. It's so good, man. It's so good. Obviously, if you can't put your opponent away quickly, there is a ceiling to the damage this deck can do. And I feel like, you know, the ceiling of this deck is not super high. It's still really consistent, though. It has a really strong early game. I feel like in the current meta, I gotta put this... I'll put it in B tier. I feel like you're still seeing a lot of grass in the meta right now. You're still seeing a lot of Celebi if you're going into those PvP random matches. It's a strong pick, man. It's a really easy deck to build. I feel like basically everybody watching this video right now, you know, you could spend a couple days ripping some packs and you could build this deck really quickly. So obviously there's no EX in the deck as well. So your opponent has to put away 3 Pokemon to pick up the win. That's always great. Early, it's got a really strong early game. It's got a pretty good mid game. It's just, there's some unfavorable matchups if it goes the distance and you can't put your opponent away. So I feel like B tier is fair for that reason. This is also one of those decks that was around during Genetic Apex and then did get a little bit better with that Mythical Island expansion, right? We did get the new Ponyta and Rapidash that came in there and they increased the ceiling for damage and the potential, and obviously you still have that luck factor, but it did get a little bit better, I would say. This deck improved with Mythical Island. So, you know, it still falls around that B tier range for me, though. You might be able to give or take. Maybe some of you in the chat are going to want to drop this down to C tier, but I think it's fair. Okay, next up we have what is probably my favorite deck in all of Pokemon TCG Pocket, and that is the Switch Trap deck. Dude, this deck is so awesome. It is so much fun. You guys have to try this deck. Let me see if I can break this down, how this deck works. So essentially you use Pidgeot's Drive Off ability with Arbok in the active slot. What this does is Arbok, whenever it uses its move, it traps the opponent in the active slot. So the idea is to have Pidgeot EX drive off to get your opponent's non-preferred Mon in the active slot, and then you trap it there and you KO it with Arbok. I have had the funniest moments using this deck where my opponent is forced to swap in a bad Mon using Pidgeot, Arbok KOs it, and then you Pokeflute, you bring it back into the bench, you drive off again and you pick up another KO. It is just so funny. The issue with this deck is that it's not consistent, but it's my favorite deck because the moments are just so funny, and I'm just out here trying to have fun, man. Obviously, you know, sometimes I'll go out there and I'll sweat when I'm on a live stream and try to go on a win streak, but other times it's nice to just have fun, right? If I'm being honest with myself, if I'm being brutally honest, dude, but I love this deck. I love this deck. I gotta put it in the D tier. Oh, dude, I love this deck so much, but it's D tier. It's just so inconsistent. I actually have so many losses using this deck. Arbok, the damage ceiling on this deck is really low. Like, yes, Arbok can trap things, but when you trap them, you're only doing 60 damage. The mid game is like decent. The late game, man, this deck just is not. You guys have to try this deck. It's so funny, but I just don't think I can put it up there. I mean, dude, compare it with some of these other decks we have up here in the S, A, and B tier. It's just not there. Now, if this tier list was based on fun, this thing's going right up here in the S tier. But no, I think D tier is fair. Okay, next up we have a heavy hitter. This deck is crazy. We have Pikachu EX. Now, the deck that I have on screen for you guys to screenshot in the bottom right hand corner of your screen, I would say is probably my favorite variant of this deck. It is so good. It uses Electrode, which, as you guys know, has no retreat cost, so you kind of eliminate some of that Sabrina pressure. You can swap in and out. Zapdos is still really good. But man, this is, I would say, one of the most consistent decks in all of Pokemon TCG Pocket. It just gets up and running so quickly. It doesn't require a whole lot of energy. If you can get that, dude, if you can just get in good opening hand with Pikachu in the active slot and you can fill your bench in the back, it's just GG. This is one of those decks where you can kind of just win depending on your open. And even if your open is not the best, you still have a couple of turns to try to build up. And, you know, you have some time before your Pikachu gets those 2 energy on it anyway. And it's just, man, it's just good. If I had to summarize this deck into one word, I would say consistent. I would say this is one of the most consistent decks in all of Pokemon TCG Pocket, and I have to put it in the S tier. Let's consider the current meta as well. I mean, look at Gyarados EX up here in the S tier. You have a ton of Articuno, Starmie, and Misty decks as well that are running rampant. Pikachu EX has the typing advantage on all of these decks. You also have Celebi a lot in the meta, and you have these Golem decks that they take a while to get set up, right? Like, you need time. You have to evolve multiple mons to get them set up, and Pikachu EX is just turn 1. Sometimes it's just off to the races with this deck. It applies so much pressure. It's got to be S tier just because of its matchups and its ability right now in the meta. Oh man, next up is one of these decks that if this list was based off of fun, it would be in the S tier, man. This deck is so funny. If I could remember the content creator that posted the video about this deck, I would shout you out so fast, man. Whoever made this deck is such a legend. I had so much fun with this deck. Where do I put it though? So if you guys aren't familiar with Victory Bell or this deck, it has what's called Fragrance Trap. And essentially with Victory Bell in the active slot, you can grab an opponent's Pokemon on their bench and bring it to their active slot. So it's similar to Pidgeot's Drive Off, only instead of the opponent choosing, you get to choose. Where this deck becomes so funny and why it's so much fun to use is because in Mythical Island, we got what's called the Poke Flute. So you can see, you gotta see where I'm going with this, right? You Fragrance Trap, you bring up your opponent's basic Pokemon with 40 HP, you one-hit KO it, then you Poke Flute on the following turn, and then you Fragrance Trap it again, dude. It's free 2 points. Oh my gosh, this deck. Oh, you can get some bad luck with this deck, but when you have it go your way, man, I'm just cracking up using this deck. It is so funny. You have Executor EX in the back, obviously, for, you know, depending on how your opening hand goes, it can be good to just apply some pressure early, have some time for Victory Bell to get set up, bring it in late, and then maybe clean up. So, man, I use this. I've had instances where I use this deck where my opponent actually goes up 2 points. You know, you might pick up a KO, or you might have 1 point, then you bring Victory Bell in, and you just cheese the end game with Poke Flutes. But where do we put this, man? That's the question, right? I feel like, again, if we're talking about fun, but we're not talking about fun. We're talking about how good the deck actually is, and I think it belongs at the bottom. right with Switch Trap, man. Oh, dude, I wish this deck was a little bit better. I think there's just so many. There's just better options in the meta. Again, even if you have Victory Bell out in the active slot, let's say your opponent gets fortunate with their evolutions, you know, you may not even be able to make something happen with Fragrance Trap, right? It's just there's too much luck factor with this deck, and so yeah, I feel like it belongs in the D tier. Okay, next up we have Venusaur EX, and this is one of those decks that I've seen so many different variations of. Obviously, the one that's on screen right now for you guys to screenshot is the variation that uses Butterfree, which is really funny. The ideal position for this deck is to have Venusaur in the active slot. You get your Butterfrees in the back. Your Butterfrees can heal you for 20 HP. Your Giant Blooms heal you for 30 HP. You have Erica healing you for 50 HP, and you have Potions healing you for 20 HP. And it can feel impossible to put Venusaur EX away. The healing pressure is bananas with this deck. I think it was Godsley that had posted a short about it where he was able to heal something crazy like 140 HP in a single turn, just ridiculous. I've been able to get set up with this where my opponent just conceded. They're like, no, screw that. I'm not playing against that. For some reason, when I think about this deck, it just kind of falls down into the C tier for me, man. We're not seeing a whole lot of Venusaur EX right now in the meta. I just think it's one of those decks where you kind of need a lot to go your way for it to work out. In this variation that I'm looking at right here, you got 2 different stage 2 Mons. You got to have some time. I don't know. The early game feels really weak for this unless you can get Executor EX out into the active slot. I don't know. Maybe you guys in the comments can give me your thoughts on Venusaur EX, but because you would think it might be a little bit stronger than it actually is, but we're just not seeing a whole lot of it. And whenever I think back on facing off against this deck, it's just not super strong. With the Mythical Island expansion, I did see some improvements to this deck that I liked a lot. I saw some people running Superior on this to try and alleviate that pressure on Giant Bloom because it does have kind of a big energy cost to get that move off, and then even whenever you do get it, it doesn't hit for the most because it would be overpowered with the healing. So, I mean, that maybe that's another reason why Venusaur EX isn't super good, because even whenever you get your Venusaur fully set up, you're not doing as much damage as some of those counterparts, right? Like, let's think about Gyarados EX in the current meta, for example. You are one-shotting a ton. You're one-shotting almost everything in the game right now. So I think for that reason, you know, getting it set up, the damage pressure isn't as high as we're seeing with some other decks. It just kind of falls down into the C tier naturally. Okay, next up we have Blastoise EX, and I must admit this is one of those decks that I've kind of seen go either way. I've been completely destroyed by this deck whenever somebody flips a bunch of heads on Misty, but I've also completely destroyed this deck. I've seen a few different variations. Obviously, in this variation, we have Starmie, we have Greninja. I've seen it run with Articuno. I've seen it run with Lapras. I've seen all kinds of interesting variations of this deck. I've also seen, we had that recent event, right, with the new Blastoise card that dropped. And obviously, it's not EX, but I think it's something like if you get 5 energy on it, the Hydro Pump does something like 140 damage. It's a really good card, and it's able to one-hit KO a lot of different Mons, and then to one-hit KO, or to remove your Blastoise, obviously it's just 1 point because it's not an EX. So there's a few different variations of this floating around. For me, I think it falls in the B tier. I don't think I can put this A tier. It's not up here. It's definitely not S tier, but it's also not C tier. It's not D tier. I think Blastoise is still really good. You know, water, man, I just feel like right now it's hard to put water decks below B tier. Water decks are just too insane. I like the Starmie variation of this deck as well because it alleviates some of that Sabrina pressure. You have a lot of decks running Sabrina. Starmie has that 0 retreat cost. It feels really good. Greninja in the back, you get that chip damage. Yeah, I don't know, man. I feel like it's a strong option, but it's not necessarily S or A tier. Okay, next up we have Machamp EX, and this is one of those decks that I feel crazy talking about it because it feels like the usage of Machamp EX is so low. I'm going to go out on a limb here. I'm going to say this is one of the most underrated cards in the entire game right now. Machamp EX is fantastic. 180 HP is bananas. 3 energy to do 120 damage. This thing is crazy. You throw Giovanni on it and you are one-shotting Celebes. There is so much potential here, and I have barely played against Machamp EX. I don't see anybody running it. It is a fantastic card, dude. I'm a big fan of Machamp EX, and nobody is running it. So, I mean, obviously, whenever you have a card that's doing 120 damage, especially against, when you have Celebi running rampant, you have cards that, I guess there are a lot of options that have, that exceed that 120 HP. But, dude, if you can get this deck to go your way, if you can get set up quickly, you will steamroll people. Obviously, you have the new Mankey that came out, which pairs really good with Primeape, where the Mankey damages itself, and then you bring in Primeape, and you're just doing like 100 HP. I don't know, man. I feel like there's lots of really good ways to complement this. Marshadow is a really good way to complement it. You could maybe like throw Druddigon up in the active slot to serve as a defensive wall, similar to like with Golem, to get Machamp going. And maybe run Leaf. Like, I could see some other variations of this deck for sure. Ultimately, though, it just feels like a really strong deck that nobody's using. Maybe we're not seeing a whole lot of usage out of Machamp because what are you supposed to use to synergize with this thing? Like, I think about those Golem decks, right? You have Brock to really help get those things up to speed. If you get some good luck on your side, you get that Golem out, it could be a little crazy, right? With Machamp EX, I do kind of like this variation that's hyper aggressive with Primeape, Ah, man, this is hard. I don't know where do I put this? I think we're actually gonna throw this Machamp EX in the B tier. Oh no, C tier. Oh man, I'm really torn here. Between B and C tier. I am going to put this in the B tier. You heard it here first. This is an underrated EX that I'm surprised more people are not using. Maybe if it didn't have 180 HP, this thing's almost got 200 HP. Like, what are we talking about? Okay, next up we have a deck that I would say is really hot in the current meta. I was playing some PvP matches on stream the other day, and I ran into this deck a ton, and that is Aerodactyl EX. Again, this is one of those decks that we're seeing a lot of different variations of. You can plug and play with a few different mons, but for the most part, I'm seeing a lot of that Marshadow. I'm seeing a lot of Hitmonlee. I've seen a little bit of Druddigon, actually, just to stall and to try to help get time where you can get that Aerodactyl up onto the field. But for the most part, I think it's so popular because of Aerodactyl's ability. I played against this deck, and Aerodactyl's ability single-handedly won my opponent the game because I could not evolve the Pokemon in my active slot. If you can play this deck well, man, it can be a huge threat in the meta. I think we also saw a pretty big spike there for a moment in tournament play with this deck, but I'm going to be honest with you guys. I think this deck falls in the B tier for me. There's just something about it, man. Like, I feel like my win rate against this deck is pretty good using a variety of different decks, My water decks seem to do pretty good against this. Celebi, a lot of times I can get Celebi into the active slot. It just negates Aerodactyl's ability entirely. Or, a lot of people that they're running Druddigon in the active slot and they're setting up their back line anyway. And so if you can kind of take Aerodactyl's ability out of the picture, it's not really putting up that crazy damage, and I feel like the ceiling for this deck is maybe a little bit lower. I think B tier is very fair. B tier is maybe surprising when you consider how much we're seeing it in the meta. I just feel like I'm playing against this so much right now, but B tier is fair. Okay, I know a lot of people watching have been waiting for this deck. We have Charizard EX. Man, what a deck. Again, I've seen plug and play with a few different cards, but I feel like the strongest variation of this deck for me is that Charizard EX, Moltres, and Arcanine EX. It is just insane. If you can pull Moltres EX turn 1 and get it in your active slot and start feeding your back line with energy, this can be crazy. Obviously, you do need some luck to go your way, right, with Moltres. It's just a single energy to get Moltres going, but you can use Moltres to feed energy into your back line. If you can get a Moltres in the active slot, Growlithe, or a Charmander on your bench, you can really start cooking, man. I've had some matches using this deck where my opponent just can't do anything. My Moltres, and Moltres isn't even that crazy of a retreat cost anyway. You're already going to have a single energy on it to try to feed your back line, and then all you need is an X speed after that. If you get a good opening hand, this deck can be bananas, and we all know how much damage Charizard EX can put up. I would say that the most surprising part of using this deck for me is how much I utilized Arcanine EX. I think Arcanine EX is another one of those cards that is just so slept on. It is so unbelievably powerful in a way that you wouldn't expect. Early game you can get it set up, especially with Moltres, and it just does crazy damage. What makes me consider S tier for this deck is the fact that we have Celebi in the meta, because even if it's just Arcanine that you're getting up, Charizard aside, Arcanine is one-hitting Celebi. Yes, it does 120 damage, but you have that typing advantage, and so all of a sudden, you're one-hit KOing anything in those Celebi decks. That's why I'm considering potentially S tier here, but I think that the proper place for this deck is in the A tier. If you guys are watching this at home and you're considering putting this deck B tier or lower, I think you are absolutely bananas. I think that Moltres EX in the active slot with, you know, these decks that, I mean, obviously you have the downside with these fire decks that they're burning energy, but that just means you need to supplement it and synergize with another card that can feed you energy. And that's what this deck has. And that's what makes it so powerful, is Moltres as the foundation of the deck. A tier feels very fair, but I totally understand if those of you watching want to throw this thing in S tier. It's, man, I'm torn. Okay, next up we have another deck that I'm seeing running absolutely rampant in the current meta, which is this Mew Variation with Greninja and Jinx. I feel like a lot of people are bringing that Jinx out because we're seeing a lot of Celebi and a lot of these cards that are stacking a bunch of energy. Man, where do I put this thing? I feel like in the last week or so, I have played against this deck so much, and honestly, it is pretty strong. I think Mythical Island bringing in cards like Mew EX, I've been seeing so much Mew EX. People love to plug and play it with a variety of decks, just because with genome hacking you can use any energy. And then obviously with Mythical Island we get budding as well, so you can bring the Mew back off the field whenever it gets low HP. There's some really good synergy there that I think is great. Greninja in the back line for chip damage, I've been seeing a lot of that as well. Jinx too. Oh man, where do I put this thing? If you're using this deck in the current meta, you are going to get some wins, but this deck does not wow me. I can't put this thing S or A tier. I think that there's a strong argument for this deck in around that B, like high B tier, like a mid B tier range. My opponent the other day had a really funny moment where I had my Celebi in the active slot with a ton of energy and I just got boo-bopped by Jinx. It is pretty fun, right? You have some funny moments with this deck. Mew can come in and do a lot of different things. You know, it depends on what your opponent is running. That's another thing with this deck, right? Is what your opponent is running is crucial, and that's going to highly depend on what your Mew EX is able to do here. I have to give props where it's due. I think Mew EX came in and became one of the most versatile cards in the entire meta. So you are going to see some wins with this deck, but I personally can't put it higher than B tier. Okay, next up is a deck that I am shocked that I don't see more people use. I've run into it a little bit in the current meta, but this Scolipede Koga Weezing deck is busted. I feel like this deck takes so many people by surprise because you're just not expecting it. Let's say you have Weezing in your active slot. You gas leak your opponent, you get them poisoned, you Koga, you bring your Weezing out, you send your Scolipede in, and you're just doing 120 damage. Oh my gosh, dude. I remember the first time I played against this deck, I was just mind blown at the pressure that this put on the field. The issue with this deck, and I think what's going to limit my decision here, is let's say you don't pull Scolipede. What happens when your Scolipede are on the bottom of your deck and you're faced with having to rely on Weezing for your damage pressure? Weezing is not putting up crazy damage. It's really not. If you get Mew in the back line, it's not always going to be that strong either. You kind of do need some luck to go your way. Oh man, but when it does go your way, man, oh man, this deck is crazy. I feel like there's going to be some people watching this video that would make the argument for A tier. Also, some people that might make the argument for C tier for this deck, as it is a little bit more luck dependent. But man, I feel like B tier is a really, really strong shout for this deck. I think if you just get some things to go your way, you're going to take your opponent by surprise. I would argue it's also, if we were making a tier list based on fun, man, this deck's going to be up there too, man. I'd put probably like A tier based on fun. Really, really fun deck to run. Super happy with it. B tier is fair though. B tier is fair for this deck. Okay, next up we got one of those decks, man. We got one of those decks. Dude, the Dragonite deck blows my mind. I was live streaming and I asked my chat where they rank the Dragonite deck. If you guys could see my chat, everybody was giving a different answer. The people that love the Dragonite deck really love the Dragonite deck, but the people that are haters and just don't believe in it, man, I feel like there's more that I dislike about this deck than I actually like about it. So for starters, it's a dual energy deck, right? You have to have both water and lightning energy in the deck. And the issue with that is that every single turn is a 50-50 chance of which energy you're going to pull. I have played against opponents that just never pull the lightning energy, or they just never pull the water energy. That alone, I already don't like. Also, what happens if your Dragonites are on the bottom of your deck? What are you going to rely on for your damage? The HP is not really there for anything else. So, and then let's say you actually do get your Dragonite out onto the field. What happens if the damage spread just doesn't go your way? If me, as an opponent of the Dragonite deck, if I have my active slot filled and I have a full bench, that damage spread, you just don't know. Like, I've seen it go both ways, though. I've seen it go where the damage spread just targets an EX and they pick up 2 points and they already had 1 point and they just win the game, right? Like, we've all experienced that where Dragonite puts in some crazy work. But I would say for the most part, there is too much luck factor here for me to put this deck even in the B tier. Oh, dude, wait, where am I going to put this thing? Oh, I got to put this in the D tier. Oh my gosh, wait, this is going to upset some people. Man, you know what? We will put Dragonite at the very bottom of C tier just because I feel like we do have some resources to try and help Dragonite get set up. Obviously, with Mythical Island, we have Druddigon that we can put in the active slot. I've seen some variations of Mew. I would say what you're seeing on screen is one of the better variations of this deck where you make use of Mew as well. So we do have resources now to try and delay this and to try to give Dragonite the best possible shot. But dude, you're just gonna get smoked by these top tier decks. You're just gonna get cooked. I want Dragonite to succeed. I want to see typings like the Dragon typing and the Steel typing get buffs and get some more help. For now, man, come on, guys. We got to put this thing in the C tier, or, you know, I know some people are just like, put this thing in the D tier. Okay, I'll meet you guys in the, we'll go like bottom of C tier. We'll go bottom of C tier. And by the way, guys, before we cover this last deck, I just want to say we're going to be doing a lot more content when the new expansion comes out. We're going to be doing tier list videos, deck review videos. We're going to be doing challenge videos. We just did the max damage challenge. That was crazy. Shout out to you guys for all the support on those live streams. And man, we're just going to be doing a lot of Pokemon TCG Pocket content. So subscribe if you are interested in shorts, live streams, more videos. We have a lot in the works. The last deck in this video. And I know we're maybe missing a couple decks, and that's okay. You guys can leave it in the comments if there's a certain deck that you wanted to see that you didn't see. And also just let me know where you would rank some of these decks anyway. But we have the King and Queen deck. First of all, I'm a sucker for decks that have a theme and cards that synergize together. And Nido Queen and Nido King, obviously, having your Nido King on the field, it benefits your Nido Queen, and she does so much more damage. But I just don't think this deck is a strong enough contender in the current meta. You need way too much to go your way. You have to get your Pokemon to these stage 2 Pokemon to evolve in the first place. The mid game for this deck is, or the early to mid game of this deck is not super strong. I've seen a couple different variations where people will run dark decks and then use either Nido Queen or Nido King. I think for the most part, though, the King and Queen deck falls into the D tier. I have not had much success running this deck, and people that try to use it against me don't really do too well. I just don't think that the pressure is there. I think you just need way too much to go your way, and even for that to happen takes too many turns to get those evolutions, and in a worst case scenario, you're not putting up enough damage. Obviously, with decks like this, there's a big upside to not having any EX and forcing your opponent to KO 3 Pokemon to pick up the win, but ultimately, it's just not the strongest option for me in the current meta. Well, I hope you guys picked up some screenshots and found some decks that you're interested in trying. I am super pumped to do more tier list videos whenever we have the expansion coming out, so stay tuned for that. I'd love to see your version of the tier list, so please send it to me. All my socials are at LevelUpRobo. Would love to see your tier lists and also your thoughts in the comments as to where you would rank some of these decks. We have a lot more Pokemon TCG Pocket content on the way, so I will see you guys next time.